So today we're talking about this is the chapter 9 in Principles of Crop Production. We'll be talking about improving plants and also some of the like principles of genetics of plants and how plants inherit characteristics. First of all, when plants reproduce, they have to be pollinated. You know, the pollen is just a little granular substance that contains the plant sperm, and it has to fertilize. The plant reproduction occurs when seeds are formed, when the male and female reproductive cells are located in flowers, and the pollen is the male, basically plant sperm is contained on pollen, and it fertilizes the female structures on plants, and then leads to the production of seeds. And self-pollination occurs when pollen is transferred to the stigma of the same flower. So basically the pollen fertilizes the same flower that it came from. And self-pollinators don't require another plant to set seed. If there was just one plant there, it could fertilize itself. And so plants like wheat and soybean are self-pollinated. And cross-pollination happens when the pollen fertilizes a different plant. And some plants can only be cross-pollinated, and those would have to have another plant to complete fertilization and set seed. And corn and alfalfa are cross-pollinated. They have to be cross-pollinated, and sorghum and cotton can be both self or cross-pollinated. And there's certain mechanisms that can promote cross-pollination, and that would be like when the pollen and the stigma mature at different times, so the plant wouldn't be ready on the same plant. Or maybe just some plants are just self-incompatible. And there's two terms for basically whether the plant has male or female flowers on different plants. And so a species that is called a dioecious plant would have male and female flowers on different plants. They'd be male plants and female plants. And monoecious plants with imperfect flowers that would not contain, they do not contain male and female structures on the same flower. And so they would be, it's like basically the male and female flowers would be on the same plant, but not on the same flower. And this is just a chart of the pollination type in different crop plants. And I won't read through the whole thing with you because it's in your book also, but basically, some of the major ones like wheat and oats are self-pollinated. Corn, potato, some of those are cross-pollinated, and some that can be both, one or the other, like cotton, sorghum, squash, things like that. And this is because corn has to be cross-pollinated. This is one reason, if you've ever planted corn in your garden, they always tell you plant several rows of corn, because if it's just like all in one or two rows, it may not, the wind may not take the pollen to enough different plants so it can be cross-pollinated. And also if you have several types of corn in one field, you're likely to get them all on one ear of corn. Like for example, if you plant maybe Indian corn in one end of of a garden and regular corn on the other, you're likely to have both types on the same ears. And inheritance in plants and everything alive is by DNA, chromosomes, and genes. So the nucleus of every plant cell has chromosomes, or the structures that control inheritance. And chromosomes are made up of DNA, and they're organized into units of DNA called genes. And they control the activity of all the cells. And every species has a certain number of different chromosomes. And in biological shorthand, the number of different chromosomes is represented by the letter N. And most cells, just ordinary body cells, like in your body or in the plant's body, would contain 2 copies of each chromosome, and those are known as diploid cells. And the 2 copies are one from the mother, one from the father. And diploid cells are said to be 2N, and some species may have more than 2 copies of each chromosome, and those are known as polyploids. That's something that happens in plants sometimes. And mitosis and meiosis you maybe remember these from high school biology or science. They're just the ways that cells divide, the 2 different cell division processes. And mitosis happens in regular, just normal body cells or plant cells. And it's the cell division process responsible for normal growth and development of the plant. So basically the DNA is duplicated, and then the cell divides into 2 new cells. And each one gets half the DNA, but there'd be 2 new cells exactly like the first one. And meiosis is a type of cell reproduction that only happens in the reproduction organs on a plant. Those would be the anthers and the ovary. And those are the cells that give rise to the egg and sperm. And so in this case, the DNA is duplicated and the cell divides twice, resulting in 4 cells. And each of them would have half the DNA of a normal cell, because a gamete, an egg, and a sperm, each one only has half of a full plant. And that's because half is inherited from each parent. And there's some more terms related to genetics. It's like if you would know the actual genes of the plant or the organism, that's called the genotype, if you would have just kind of a list of the actual genes. But the phenotype is what you can see. You can't really look at a plant and see exactly what its genes are, but the phenotype is the appearance and characteristics of the plant that you can see. And they'd be, the characteristics would be things like height, color, seed production, and it's the result of the genotype, but also the environment and their interaction, because the environment would have an effect too. And heritability is the proportion of any given phenotype that is controlled by genetic factors, because some of it is environmental. The way a plant looks might be determined by its environment partly. But the part that's genetic is heritability. Those are the traits that can be passed on to offspring. And the common patterns and principles of inheritance that we know now were discovered in the 1800s by an Austrian monk named Gregor Mendel. And he worked in the monastery garden, and he started studying the different characteristics of pea plants. So he noticed that, the peas had different characteristics that seemed to be, when you crossed them, they were inherited by the future generations in, certain proportions. And he started doing studies, trying to figure out how that worked. And he didn't really understand about genes and whatever, but he kind of discovered the principles of inheritance just by crossing his plants and looking at what he got. And so different versions of a gene are called alleles. And each organism would have 2 alleles for each gene, like each plant would have 2 alleles for each gene, one on each chromosome, homologous chromosome. And so one is inherited from each parent. And so if both chromosomes have the same allele for a trait, the organism is said to be homozygous for that trait. Like if there's an allele for purple flowers and both of the chromosomes have that same allele, that they would be homozygous. But if the 2 chromosomes have different alleles for a trait, that organism would be called heterozygous for the trait. Like if it had one gene for purple flowers and one gene for pink flowers or something like that. And sometimes when there's 2 different alleles in one organism, one of them would be called the dominant allele, and that would mask the appearance of the other, which is the recessive allele. So like if purple was dominant and white was recessive, if you had one gene for purple and one for white, the flower would be purple, because the dominant allele masks the recessive. And so the recessive trait would only show up if the plant has 2 copies. So it would have to have 2 copies of the gene for white flowers, and then it would be white. It would get one from the mother, one from the father, or one from each parent plant. And there's 2 different types of inheritance, qualitative and quantitative. And these little boxes are called Punnett squares, and they also are kind of used by geneticists to kind of show how inheritance happens between, 2 plants or whatever, if you know the genes that they have. And so qualitative traits have distinct classes, maybe like the color of the flowers, the shape of the seeds, are they wrinkled or smooth, or disease resistance. It's things that are either or, like the flowers are either purple or white, or like in this case, the pods would be either yellow or green. And this may be controlled by just a few genes. And you can look at like the little square off to the left, you're crossing, that you just put the genes of each parent, one go like on the top and one down the side, and then you just put the cross between those 2 genes in each little square. Like, for example, the yellow pod would be recessive. The recessives are always written in a small letter, and so that one would have like little g, And then the green pod is dominant, which are written in capitals, so it would have big G. And then just in each square you would, cross the two alleles for that. These represent the possible genetics phenotypes of all the offspring of those two plants. And so in that case, each one would be big G, little g, and there would be a green pod because that's dominant. But then in the little square on the right, you have a green pod that is heterozygous, big G, little g, crossed with a recessive, which is little g, basically a yellow plant. And then in that case, you would have, in the one on the left, there's like 100% green. But in this one, because of the way it comes out, the offspring would end up being approximately 50% green and 50% yellow. And we'll maybe have some little exercises where we work on that a little more. And then quantitative inheritance is things that are a continuous range rather than distinct classes. It'd be like plant height, biomass, seed production. There's things, like you don't have all tall plants and all short plants are not two distinct classes. There's a range. You would have kind of most of the plants would be average, kind of in a bell curve type arrangement. And then maybe there would be some that are short ones and some really tall ones, but it's a distinct range basically rather than distinct classes. And these can involve interaction between many genes. And the little diagram kind of shows how that might happen. There's lots of different ways it might happen, but in this case, they crossed a taller plant with a shorter one, and then they crossed the plants they got in the first generation and end up with one, like some of them very tall and some very short. And they would all vary among, kind of in the range of height. And then if you were kind of looking for taller ones, you would probably continue to cross the taller ones. But sometimes they might still possibly have a shorter offspring every now and then, depending on what the genetics was. And then people have been breeding plants for desirable characteristics since they first noticed that offspring plants tend to resemble parents. And also the same with animals. They've been breeding, livestock and other animals, dogs, cats. All the dogs we have are the result of breeding from something that was like a wolf to start with. And some modern crops like corn bear little resemblance to their wild ancestors because of human selection. The original corn plant had probably several little ears on it. It was a branching plant with several small ears, and that it didn't have the nice big cobs that they do now. And they've kind of over years of breeding and selection, they've come to look the way they are now. And selection of seed from superior plants and using it for planting has resulted in local land races or varieties. And today, plant breeders will improve plants with specific techniques that they've developed based on the understanding of genetics. And the objective of these breeding programs is to develop superior cultivars. And the word cultivar just means cultivated variety. And that's an internationally recognized term for a group of genetically similar plants of the same species that kind of may have, can be distinguished from other groups. And the goals of plant breeding is, to develop superior yield, disease and insect resistance, drought resistance, all the things we want in a plant, basically. And with things that are not, not like a grain crop or whatever, it could be things like, forage quality and, like maybe bread making quality of wheat, oil content of corn, soybeans, and the fiber in cotton. And harvestability is something that relates to maybe not so much the yield, but specific characteristics that can reduce loss of crop. That can be things like lodging resistance. Lodging is when it falls over. And so the plants that have a stronger stalk that won't lodge. Maybe uniformity of maturity, ideally all the plants in the field should mature at the same rate for a uniform harvest. Shattering resistance is just resistance to loss of seed from the head of a grain crop during harvest. If it shatters and falls out during harvest, you lose too much of it. And then maybe something like the dry down rate of grain. That's just if it dries down in the field more, you would be able to harvest earlier and lose less in the field. And then persistence is just long-term survivability. That's especially important for things like alfalfa that you don't plant every year. You want your alfalfa stand to last for several years. And then the strategies of breeding plants are just, first they start out by getting together genetically diverse breeding materials, maybe collecting seeds from a variety of sources, and you want to get as much variation as you can. You could have anything depending on the plant and what's available. You could have native varieties, maybe even weedy relatives. Also some of the established cultivars, if there are any, and then local land races. And there are seed banks throughout the country. There's a list of those on page 211. And then you would select the individual plants with those of the superior characteristics that you're looking for, and then cross two plants to determine the desirable characteristics from the two parents. And that process is called hybridization. The cross, the plant, the offspring of two different parents of different types is a hybrid. And then you'd evaluate the new materials and maybe grow the hybrids in different environments. And if one performs really well, it could be released as a commercial cultivar if it does really well. And places like NDSU and other like research colleges, land grant schools do this type of research every year, and they publish their yearly wheat trials, corn trials, what they've learned during the summer. And then there's also something called genetic engineering that's in the news quite a bit. Some people are against it for whatever reason and for it for whatever reason. But genetic engineering is just directly modifying the genetic material by deleting, adding, or changing genes. And that uses a process called recombinant DNA. And that's been just DNA that's been altered to contain genes from different organisms. And DNA can be grown in bacteria, yeast, viruses, and transferred to other species. And plants that have or express DNA that's been genetically modified are called transgenic plants, or more commonly we hear them as genetically modified organisms or GMOs. And so genetically, a couple main, products of genetic engineering in agricultural plants have been herbicide-resistant crop plants. If you've heard of Roundup-ready plants, glyphosate or Roundup kills plants by inhibiting an enzyme used by plants to make an essential amino acid. And normally Roundup or glyphosate kills anything green. It's not specific to any certain plants. So it would kill the crop as well as the weeds. But the glyphosate resistant or Roundup ready plants have been given a bacterial gene that codes for an enzyme that would function in the presence of Roundup or of glyphosate. So that allows farmers to use glyphosate, and then there's other herbicides that they developed resistant plants for as well. You can use those herbicides to kill the weeds without harming the crop. And another genetically engineered type of plant are plants that have been given resistance to insects with a gene called Bt. And Bt is from a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis. And when insects eat Bt, it kills them by damaging their digestive tract. So the Bt gene has been inserted into plants to increase resistance to feeding by insects. Specifically corn, corn is one of the first ones to deter feeding by European corn borers. And what it does is when the insect has to eat a little bit of it, and then the Bt gene that's in the plant will make the insect sick and it will die. And there are, you've probably heard of the controversy over GMOs. Some people absolutely refuse to accept them. A lot of the European countries don't want anything genetically modified. And there are risks and benefits that we need to be aware of if we're, going to be using them. Benefits is reduced need for pesticides. And Roundup Ready technology also makes conservation tillage possible because it's much easier to control the weeds. It's necessary to control the weeds with herbicide, if you're not tilling as much. And also plants that are tolerant of environmental stress have been developed, and then also other improved characteristics such as shelf life. In some cases, GMOs have been developed to improve nutrition. And for example, rice normally doesn't have a lot of vitamin A, but golden rice has been developed that it's a genetically modified type of rice that has a high concentration of vitamin A. And this is really important in countries where the main food is maybe one of the main foods they can get is rice, but there's like very, in some developing countries, there's very high deficiencies in vitamin A, and that can lead to blindness and death. But this way the people are able to get a source of vitamin A that they wouldn't have had normally. And then some of the risks, overuse of Roundup and a few other herbicides has led to herbicide resistance. There's some weeds that are starting to be tolerant of Roundup as well. We'll talk about that later. And insect resistance to Bt is always possible too. That's why usually along with raising Bt corn, you have to raise like a small plot or whatever of susceptible corn, because if the insects, if there is a resistance gene in some insects, eventually those survivors will be the only ones reproducing and we won't be able to use it anymore. And there may be unintentional effects on non-target organisms that we don't know about. And because the GMOs are patented organisms, the companies that own that develop them own the patent, so farmers can't save and use seeds like they've always done in the past, and there's been some lawsuits over that. And then also, I don't know if this has ever happened, but there would be the possibility of outcrossing with weedy relatives, and possibly the Roundup Ready genes would transfer into weeds. I don't know how much of a possibility this is or if it's ever happened, but it is something to be aware of. Okay, that's all we have for this chapter. If you have any questions, please let me know.